this Ukrainian tank brigade has been trying to hold the Russians back and has been inflicting incredibly heavy losses on the Russians. They told me their brigade alone had inflicted around 3,000 Russian kills, that they've confirmed by video, in that sector of the front. And there's other brigades fighting alongside them. So it's a really terrifically heavy losses that the Russians are taking in that area.
You are just back from Ukraine, aren't you, where you were with soldiers of a Ukrainian tank company on the front line near Kostiantynivka in Donetsk. What's the situation there, and how close are the Russians?
So this Kostiantynivka is a really important rail and road junction, which would give Putin a really useful amount of control over that area of the Donbass region. And he's been desperate to take. He's been pushing from one direction through Chasiv Yar, and now he's pushing up from Toretsk, which the Russian forces have all but occupied. And this Ukrainian tank brigade has been trying to hold the Russians back and has been inflicting incredibly heavy losses on the Russians. They told me their brigade alone had inflicted around 3,000 Russian kills, that they've confirmed by video, in that sector of the front. And there's other brigades fighting alongside them. So it's a really terrifically heavy losses that the Russians are taking in that area, but they continue to push forwards. And what they're trying to do is small groups of Russian soldiers try and infiltrate Ukrainian positions. Ukrainians don't have enough men to hold large swathes of territory. It's difficult for them to hold the line. So the Russians infiltrate one or two soldiers. They get to a kind of stronger position, like a house or something behind Ukrainian lines, and then they gather in a kind of platoon size and try and assault Ukrainian positions from behind. At that point, the Ukrainians are normally spotting them with drones and picking them off as they do it, but every now and again they succeed. And they told me about this one instance where a platoon had managed to gather in an industrial building on the outskirts of Toretsk.
And Maxim, you said they've all but taken Toretsk. I mean, how much of Toretsk has been occupied by Russians now?
So it's a back and forth battle, but the Russians are at the northernmost tip of the town, and they're fighting with the Ukrainians over an industrial zone. The Ukrainians are trying to make counterattacks to push the Russians back from that. But really, the line seems to be held. The top of the town is held by the Russians, and then there's a series of fields and then and some villages, one called Dachna, where the Ukrainians are holding the lines there. And stopping the Russians from advancing any further for now. It's very difficult to advance in today's modern warfare, with drones in the air. It's very difficult to advance across wide open spaces.
And this is a fight that's been going on for 7 or 8 months, is that right, in the Toretsk area? How intense has the fighting been?
It's incredibly intense. It's been, very close quarters urban combat for a lot of this. Ukrainian infantry in one building firing at Russian infantry in another building. The Ukrainians say it's easier for the Russians to fight through urban terrain, actually, because they're able to take cover from the drones in these houses, and it makes it more difficult for the Ukrainians to deploy the kind of FPV tactics that they've been using very successfully in this war. And the Russians simply use their weight in numbers to keep pushing and overwhelm the Ukrainians, but they're doing it at terrific cost. They're taking thousands and thousands of casualties. The Ukrainians estimate that the Russians have lost 13,500 missing in action over the course of the Battle of Toretsk. Now, almost all of those are probably killed, but the nature of the battlefield now is that it's very difficult to retrieve your wounded, very difficult to retrieve your dead, because any vehicle that goes out into the open to try and take people back from their positions is immediately targeted by FPV drones. And you have to think really carefully about whether you're going to risk lives to send people to collect dead bodies.
The Supreme Allied Commander Europe, General Christopher Cavalli, recently told the Senate Armed Forces Committee that over the last 3 years, the effectiveness of the Russian ground forces has deteriorated, whereas the Ukrainian forces has improved. How has that changed and the way they fight on the front line?
I think, we've seen that Ukrainians adapt to technology faster than the Russians. The problem is that the Russians then catch up and they're able to use these kind of technologies at scale. They seem to be better at scaling up their industrial effort, especially because they haven't been under the same kind of pressure of nightly strikes that the Ukrainians are under from Russian jets and missiles. Ukraine has been incredibly effective given what it started with. The manpower issue is a really serious one, and I think it's not one to gloss over. But I think Cavoli was trying to make the point to Americans that you have this global rival, very aggressive global rival, and investing in Ukraine's defense is an investment in Europe and possibly the US's defense. And it's the best, most cost-effective way that you have to erode Russian armed forces. The Ukrainians, for a fraction of the cost of the American defense budget, have eviscerated the enormous Russian war machine, and that is, something that I think many Americans might consider a good use of taxpayers' money.
And he also pointed out something that you mentioned, alluded to earlier, the fact that where Russian forces are trying to break the front lines, they've gone from company-sized attacks to platoon and now even smaller. You talked about that a little bit earlier as well, about the small numbers making the small advances. Do you think that's sustainable?
Well, it's more sustainable in terms of manpower, but it's obviously not going to get you a strategic breakthrough. I mean, it's a policy of attrition where you just wear down the enemy and you will take hundreds of meters, maybe kilometers at a time. Um, but it doesn't really give you the manpower to create a breakthrough that you can then exploit with armored vehicles. And we see actually again there was a very large Russian column moving towards the front lines, which was destroyed by the Ukrainians just the other week, because that is ultimately the way that you need to penetrate and break through lines and cause a kind of a collapse in and get in behind Ukrainian defenses. Now, one of the problems that the Russians face is that this war has been going on for so long, and the Ukrainians are very well dug in and fortified in all of these areas, and they're expecting attacks regularly. So, this small groups tactic, it can get you some advances, but it's never going to get you what you want, all of the Donbass or all of Kherson or all of Zaporizhia region.
I was going to ask you how much of Donetsk Oblast is under Russian occupation at the moment, and have the peace negotiations made any difference to the intensity of fighting for it?
Well, the only thing that peace negotiations seem to be doing is accelerating the conflict and the level of intensity, as the Russians maybe are trying to take as much territory as they can before any peace negotiation. And they're also aware that this is a window where the Ukrainians are not counting on supplies from the US. So even if they have enough for the time being, the Ukrainians still have to ration their supplies. But if they knew that they were going to get a new shipment of weapons from the Trump administration, they could fight much more effectively. They could use a lot more of their arsenal against the Russians to stop the Russians. So it's just encouraging the Russians to attack harder and further.
And to that point, your next upcoming article, Maxim, is going to be about the use of chemical weapons by Russian forces. Can you tell us a bit more about what you know and whether or not this desire to take more land is driving an increase in the use of these weapons?
So certainly, what we know is that the Ukrainians have reported an increase of a quadrupling, actually, of the use of chemical weapons um, since Donald Trump's election. So it suggests that this is a really part of a concerted effort to drive forward, and also an understanding that there will be impunity for these kind of actions with the current US administration. I think what's happening is that because the Ukrainians are well dug in and well fortified, and the Russians have found it so difficult to dislodge them, what they're trying to do is essentially smoke them out. And there has been very widespread use, and it's been confirmed by the OPCW. There's been use of tear gases on the front lines in Ukraine to drive Ukrainian soldiers out of their positions where they can be killed out in the open. And what we've been investigating is actually the mysterious deaths of a lot of soldiers who were reported gas. And we've been to the city morgue and we've spoken to pathologists, and how we have witnesses to 6 deaths of Ukrainian soldiers where it appears that some kind of more lethal gas could have been used by the Russians. These soldiers died without any signs of external injuries. The only clue to their death was foam around the mouth, which, we spoke to experts, suggests that there was some kind of irritant used that affected the way that they were able to breathe and ultimately contributed to their demise.
This is horrific. How did you actually find out about this in the first place?
So we're always visiting the front lines to try and find out what the current situation is, and we were speaking to some of these units about other stories, and what the main focus of the story was going to be how the Russians are trying to push to get close to the Zaporizhia city. They're trying to take the town of Orikhiv in order to get within shelling range of Zaporizhia, which is the capital of this region, Zaporizhia, that Putin has claimed but doesn't actually fully control. It's really important for him to take Zaporizhia. And when we went to the front lines to visit those soldiers, they were warning us, you've got to have a gas mask. Asking why do we need to have a gas mask? Why is it so important? And then they started to show us. They showed us all of the kind of tear gas grenades that were used, these homemade devices that the Russians are using to try and presumably use more lethal gases to. And we started talking to soldiers in other units and other areas of the front lines about their experiences, and we found a number of deaths as a result of that. When we had 2 identified deaths, we went to the Dnipro morgue to ask, what the pathologists thought about these deaths. They confirmed that they didn't have any external injuries, and then they told us that there were 12 more deaths that were similar, and they suspected chemical agents were at play.
And I guess, Maxim, it's not that easy to get your hands on a gas mask, is it?
Well, we have one. Thankfully, we have them at the times. It was they were handed out to us because of actually Zaporizhia, because of the threat of a nuclear incident around the Zaporizhia power plant. We have respirators that are designed for that. I mean, for the Ukrainians, it has become increasingly important. And actually, we spoke to the Ministry of Defense about these claims of lethal chemical weapons use, and they said that they obviously indicated that they'd recognized this was an issue. And the UK government said they just contributed in December £4 million worth of gas masks to the Ukrainians. So gas masks are increasingly being supplied to Ukrainian troops.
Maxim, it's been really good talking to you. Look forward to seeing your article. It'll be coming out in the coming days, I understand. I'd better let you get back to work, but thank you very much for your time.
Thanks very much, Kate.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news or read it on thetimes.com.